Close your eyes and imagine the longest 10 minutes of your life. Maybe you are waiting for a test result or sitting in the back of an ambulance. 10 minutes of absolute terror can feel like a lifetime. Now, imagine that feeling stretching out for 39 years. 14,235 days. That is how long you are going to spend locked in a concrete box for a crime you didn't commit. And the most terrifying part? The day it begins feels like a completely normal day. You were 18 years old. It was May 1975 in Cleveland, Ohio. You had your whole life mapped out in front of you. The summer was just starting to heat up the city sidewalks. You were a teenager in a working-class neighborhood. You spent your afternoons hanging out with your best friends, brothers Ronnie and Wiley Bridgman. You walked down to the park, you talked about girls, you talked about getting jobs, you talked about the future. You were just 3 kids killing time in the afternoon heat. A few blocks away, outside the Fairmont cut-rate grocery store, a local salesman named Harold Franks was walking to his car. It was a busy street. People were everywhere. Suddenly, 2 men approached him. One of them threw acid directly into Frank's face. As he screamed, the other man pulled out a .38 caliber revolver and fired. Franks collapsed onto the pavement. The 2 men grabbed his briefcase and sprinted away down the block. Chaos erupted. Police sirens wailed in the distance, cutting through the heavy humidity. But you didn't hear them. You and the Bridgman brothers were nowhere near the grocery store. You didn't know Harold Franks. You had absolutely nothing to do with what had just happened on that bloody sidewalk. You went home, ate dinner, and went to sleep, completely oblivious to the fact that the Cleveland Police Department was desperate to close this high-profile murder case, and they didn't care who paid for it. Nearly a week passed. It was May 25th. You were sitting inside your house. The street outside was quiet. Then, you heard heavy footsteps marching up your front porch. It wasn't a casual knock. It was a pounding that shook the door frame. Before you could even turn the doorknob entirely, the door was shoved open. Uniformed police officers flooded into your living room. Rough hands grabbed your shoulders and spun you around. You were slammed against the wall. The cold, heavy metal of handcuffs bit into your wrists. You asked what was going on. You asked if this was some kind of mistake. They didn't answer. They marched you out the front door. Down the street, you saw the police dragging Ronnie and Wiley out of their houses too. They shoved you into the back of a cruiser. The vinyl seats were hot against your skin. You watched your neighborhood shrink in the rearview mirror, completely unaware that you were looking at the free world for the very last time in the 20th century. As the cruiser pulled up to the station, the reality of the summer street faded into the sterile, terrifying fluorescent glare of the precinct. The interrogation room smelled like stale tobacco, sweat, and cheap institutional coffee. The detectives walked in. They dropped a manila folder on the metal table with a heavy thud. They looked at you not like a person, but like paperwork they needed to file before their shift ended. They told you about Harold Franks. They told you about the acid and the .38 revolver. They told you that you and the Bridgman brothers were the ones who pulled the trigger. You laughed. A nervous, confused laugh. You told them they had the wrong guys. You told them exactly where you were, who you were with. You gave them your alibi, expecting them to write it down, to go check it, to realize their massive mistake. You expected the system to work. But the detective just leaned in, his face inches from yours. He tapped the folder. "We have a witness," he said. Your stomach dropped, but your brain couldn't process the math. How could you have a witness to a murder you didn't commit? You didn't know it yet, but that witness was a 12-year-old boy named Eddie Vernon. On the day of the murder, Eddie wasn't even at the grocery store. He was riding a public school bus. But the neighborhood had been buzzing with rumors, and another kid on the bus told Eddie that you and the Bridgman brothers had done it. Eddie, just a kid trying to be helpful and feel important, had walked up to a police officer at the crime scene and repeated the playground gossip as if it were a fact. But when the detectives brought Eddie into the terrifying environment of the precinct to get his official statement, the boy realized what he had done. He tried to backpedal. He told the police that he didn't actually see the shooting, that he was on the bus, and that he had only heard the names from a friend. He was legally blind in one eye. He couldn't have seen it clearly anyway. Instead of accepting that their star witness was just repeating gossip, the Cleveland detectives decided to force the puzzle pieces to fit. They wanted a conviction. They locked the 12-year-old in a room. They slammed their hands on the table. They accused Eddie of lying. They told the terrified child that because he had already given them the names, if he changed his story now, he was committing perjury. They threatened to arrest his parents and throw them in jail. Then, to make sure his story would hold up in court, the police explicitly fed him the classified details of the crime scene that a bystander wouldn't know. The specific .38 caliber weapon, the acid thrown in the victim's face. They pulled you out of the chair and threw you into a police lineup. You stood under harsh, buzzing lights next to men you didn't know. You squinted through the one-way glass, trying to see who was on the other side. On the other side of that glass, terrified and crying, a 12-year-old boy raised a trembling finger and pointed at your chest. And just like that, the trap snapped shut. Once that trap closed, the machinery of justice moved terrifyingly fast. The cramped interrogation room dissolved into a massive, echoing courtroom. You were sitting in a hard wooden chair. The air was thick and warm. You wore a suit that didn't quite fit right, staring at a jury box full of strangers who held your beating heart in their hands. The prosecution called their star witness. The heavy wooden doors opened, and in walked Eddie. He was so small he barely filled the witness stand. His feet didn't even touch the floor. You looked at him, waiting for him to break. You waited for him to look at the judge and cry, "I made a mistake. The police made me do it." But he didn't look at you. He stared straight ahead, reciting the exact script the detectives had hammered into his brain. He said he saw you pull the trigger. He said he saw you run. You looked at your court-appointed lawyer, waiting for the devastating cross-examination. You waited for your lawyer to ask about the boy's eyesight, or the fact that his school bus route didn't even go past the crime scene. You waited for him to call the other kids on the bus who could prove Eddie was lying. But your lawyer barely stood up. He asked a few half-hearted questions, stumbled over his own notes, and sat back down. You wanted to scream. You wanted to stand up and shake the jury, to beg them to look at the massive, glaring holes in the story. But you were told to sit down and be quiet. The jury went out. They came back. The foreman stood up and read the word that would erase you from the earth. Guilty. The judge banged his gavel. He didn't just send you to prison, he sentenced you to death by electrocution. You were 18 years old. Your knees gave out. The bailiffs grabbed you by the arms and dragged you out of the courtroom. The last thing you saw before the doors closed was the prosecutor, shaking hands with the detective. That handshake sealed your fate. You were sent straight to death row. You spent your nights listening to the guards test the electric chair down the hall. The lights in your cell dimmed every time they pulled the switch. 2 years later, the Supreme Court outlawed the death penalty in Ohio. They commuted your sentence to life in prison. But life in there wasn't living. It was just breathing in a concrete box. The 1970s turned into the 1980s. You watched the world change on a grainy 13-inch television bolted to the wall in the day room. You watched presidents get elected and leave office. You watched the invention of the internet, cell phones, a world moving faster and faster, leaving you behind in the dark. Your youth evaporated. Your hair started to turn gray. The mirror above your metal sink reflected a man you barely recognized. You spent your days in the prison law library. You read every legal textbook you could get your hands on. You wrote letters, hundreds of letters, to judges, to innocence projects, to journalists. You typed until your fingers bled, begging someone, anyone, to look at the original police reports. Every few months, the mail call brought a thick envelope, your appeals, stamped with a cold red "denied." Every time you got a denial, a little piece of your soul chipped off. You lost your family, one by one. You got the news through a smeared plexiglass window in the visitation room. When your mother passed away, you weren't allowed to go to the funeral. You mourned her in an 8x10 cell, lying on a thin plastic mattress, staring at a cinder block ceiling, listening to the screams of men losing their minds in the solitary block down the hall. You spent your 20s, your 30s, your 40s, and your 50s inside that cage. 39 years, 14,235 days, every single one of them for a crime you didn't commit. But even in a cage, time didn't stand still. You were deep into your third decade behind bars. It was 2011. The world outside had moved on to smartphones and social media, but your reality was still rust, concrete, and the prison law library. You had filed so many appeals that you knew the legal jargon better than the lawyers who put you there. But the justice system has a terrifying feature. It values finality over factual innocence. They didn't care if you didn't do it. They only cared that the paperwork was filed correctly back in 1975. Then, a crack formed in the concrete. A journalist named Kyle Swenson started digging into your case for a local magazine. He pulled the original police reports. He read the trial transcripts. He saw exactly what you had been screaming about for 36 years. There was no physical evidence, no weapon, no motive. Just the word of a 12-year-old boy whose eyesight was terrible and who wasn't even at the scene. The magazine published the story. For the first time, the public read the truth. The article caught the eye of the Ohio Innocence Project. Suddenly, you weren't fighting alone. You had real lawyers now. They tracked down Eddie Vernon. Eddie was 52 years old then. He had spent his entire adult life carrying the ghost of your stolen youth. The guilt had sent him to the hospital. It had kept him awake for 14,000 nights. Eddie sat down with his pastor and finally broke. He admitted the horrifying truth. Cleveland detectives had fed him the details. They had threatened to lock up his parents if he didn't testify. He perjured himself because he was a terrified child cornered by men with badges. You heard the news in your cell. Your heart pounded so hard it physically hurt your chest. You thought that was it. You thought the judge would read Eddie's confession, apologize, and hand you the keys. But you forgot how the system worked. The state didn't want to let you go. If they admitted they were wrong about you, they had to admit their detectives were corrupt. They had to admit they stole 39 years from an innocent man. So, the prosecutors fought back. It was November 2014. You were brought back to the courthouse for an evidentiary hearing. Eddie Vernon took the witness stand again. The last time he sat in that chair, his feet didn't touch the floor. Now, he was a grown man weeping openly in front of the judge. He looked at you, really looked at you, and he said, "I don't know any of these men. I was trying to please the police." But the prosecutors attacked him. They accused him of making up this new story. They tried to tear apart his confession, desperate to protect a 39-year-old lie. You sat at the defense table, gripping the wood, watching the state try to keep you in a cage to save their own pride. It came down to the judge. The prosecutors rested their case, demanding you be sent back to prison to die. Your lawyers looked at the bench. The judge reviewed the evidence. He looked at the weeping man who lied as a child. He looked at the prosecutors who refused to concede. And finally, he looked at you. He leaned into his microphone. The court finds the testimony of Edward Vernon to be credible. The state realized they had lost. The prosecutors officially dismissed the charges. The gavel fell. 39 years, 3 months, 9 days. That was how long it took for the truth to catch up to the lie. When it finally did catch up, the end came almost too quietly. The courtroom cleared out, and for the first time in 39 years, nobody put handcuffs on you. You walked out of the courthouse doors and the sunlight hit your face. It felt entirely different without barbed wire cutting across the sky. You were surrounded by reporters shoving microphones in your face. They wanted to see you angry. They wanted you to scream about the stolen years, the corrupt cops, the broken system. They asked you about Eddie. They asked you how much you hated the man who stole your life. You looked into the cameras, took a deep breath, and you said the words that shocked the world. "I forgive him." You told them that Eddie was a victim too. He was a terrified child, manipulated by men with badges and guns. You refused to let the hatred that built your prison cell follow you out into the free world. You survived. You were the longest-serving wrongfully convicted person in United States history to be exonerated at the time. You walked away from the cameras, stepping into a world you hadn't touched since you were 18. The system didn't break. The system worked exactly the way it was designed to. It took a child from the streets, and it buried him alive. If Ricky's story opened your eyes to how fragile our justice system really is, please hit the like button and subscribe to Oddly Accurate. Let me know in the comments down below, what case should we cover next?